choose this space. It's really been very convenient. My name is Larry Parlberg. I'm the director or the directed at the Lew Wallace Museum. Kind of depends on the day. But each year we host an annual exhibit at the Carriage House that looks at some aspect of Lew's life, Ben-Hur, or maybe the Wallace family. And this year we're highlighting things that have come into the collection in the last 10 years or so. And so each of our programs this year are kind of tied somehow into collecting things. If you've not seen the exhibit, I encourage you to come over. We're going to take it apart in early December, and it's worth seeing, so I'd encourage you to do that. Tonight, we're going to look at Thomas Jefferson's Revolutionary Garden, and there was some collecting that went on with that, but there's a lot more, as you know, with the gardens to talk about. Peter J. Hatch to be official, is a professional garden historian with 40 years of experience, basically, most all of it at Monticello. He was involved with the restoration, care, interpretation of the historic landscapes there, so this is like the guy. He's a celebrated author with 4 books on Monticello. His most recent book is out here. They're for sale. He can sign them for you after the talk, so I encourage you to look at those seriously. He's lectured in 38 different states, and I thought Indiana might be the 39th, but it's not. He's already been in Indiana somewhere. But he's talked on Jefferson and the history of garden plants. Presently, he's retired from Monticello, so presently he gardens and botanizes from his home in Crozet.
Crozet, Virginia, named after a French engineer before the Civil War would have come to the Blue Ridge.
There you go. See? Write it down if you're taking notes. He does consult on installations and the maintenance of both public gardens and private estate gardens and landscapes. And actually, I was lucky enough to know Peter through his service as president of Southern Garden History Society back in the 1990s, a really great person. And he does not know this, but the first meeting where I was on that board to go, he was hosting at Monticello, and I asked him kind of teasingly how early I could come to the meeting. He said, "I don't care, come at midnight." So I went at 4 a.m. And this is in the days before, and he doesn't know this, this is the days before 9/11, and so I just told the guard, I'm here for a meeting with Peter, and he said, "Oh, go on up." So I had the mountaintop to myself for about 3 hours. It was an amazing experience. I went to Peter's website, and there's a couple quotes about him I thought I would share. This is from David McCullough, who said, "Not since Jefferson himself has anyone combined such love and knowledge of all that blooms and grows and bears fruit at Monticello as does Peter Hatch. Indeed, if Jefferson were to return, I doubt there would be anyone he would rather more enjoy talking to than Peter Hatch." So you're in for a treat. On the flip side, this is a guy from Charlottesville with a local paper said of Peter, "He's a muscular man who, with his infectious laugh and wild hair, looks like a cross between Beethoven and a wood sprite." So it's your call, okay? And with no further ado, I'm going to leave now before he hurts me. Thanks, Peter. So I'm going to give that to you.
Okay.
And put that there.
Great.
And maybe your double mic.
Can't be too sure. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about Thomas Jefferson's vegetable garden, which may seem like a dry topic, but I hope you won't think so. I don't think Jefferson needs too much of an introduction. He wanted to remember for 3 things. Not including the being president of the United States for 2 terms or sponsoring both the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Louisiana Purchase. He wanted to be remembered for being the author of the Declaration of Independence, one of the most enduring written documents that's ever been conceived, carried by freedom lovers at the Berlin Wall and Tiananmen Square. Second was his authorship of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which established in Virginia the separation of church and state. At the time, only Episcopalians could vote in Virginia elections, male, land-owning Episcopalians. Third was the founding of the University of Virginia, which Jefferson hoped would contribute to what he called the illimitable freedom of the human mind, a ringing phrase that I just love to hear myself recite, the illimitable freedom of the human mind. So Jefferson was very much in freedom, but here was the man who wrote that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, but he owned some 500 souls over his lifetime. There's good and bad in Thomas Jefferson. By our standards today, there's almost nothing that could be worse. But Jefferson wrote about gardening that the failure of one thing could be repaired by the success of another. So maybe Jefferson's positive contributions could overcome the stain of his ownership of slaves at Monticello, some 500 over his 83-year-old lifetime. Monticello, of course, was Jefferson's home, just outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, 812 feet high. Monticello means little mountain. It's remarkable because it's really an autobiography of Thomas Jefferson, and that tells us about all the different dimensions of his creative mind. You see Jefferson as a scientist, as an architect, as a farmer, as a classicist, as a book lover, as an astronomer and anthropologist, and particularly, I think, as a gardener. A lot of different dimensions to Jefferson's interest in gardening. His overseer, Edmund Bacon, recalled that the flower gardens included a number of things he'd never seen before, and they bloomed virtually every month of the year. When people would come to Monticello, they were given tours of what one visitor referred to as Mr. Jefferson's pet trees. Jefferson was a keen landscape designer, and he included landscape design among the fine arts. He said many reckon about painting, music, sculpture, architecture, poetry. Others have added gardening as a seventh fine art. Not horticulture, he wrote, but the art of embellishing grounds by fancy. And believe me, he had a lot of fanciful schemes for the landscape at Monticello. He was a keen and avid botanist and would go on botanical rambles as far away as upstate New York, and he had this species of flower named in his honor, a native wildflower that grows in the richest coves of the Appalachian forest, Jeffersonia diphylla, or twin leaf. And it was named for Jefferson by a very prominent early American botanist named Benjamin Smith Barton, who said that it was Jefferson's knowledge of natural history, particularly of zoology and botany, that was rivaled by that of few people in the United States. The only book that Jefferson wrote was called The Notes on the State of Virginia, and was written in large part to refute the claims of European scientists who argued that the natural productions of eastern North America, from our plants to our native Indians to our animals, our native animals, were somehow an inferior copy of those of Europe's. A French scientist named Buffon, wrote that it was the excessive humidity in the eastern United States that resulted in the natural degeneracy of things like the size of elk horns or elk antlers, or a number of other aspects of the natural history of eastern North America. And this is a page, original page from the Notes of the State of Virginia. It's a botanical survey of the plants that were native to Virginia. Some 300 plants, organized according to whether they're medicinal or ornamental or useful for building things, or one other category I can't remember. Jefferson grew 170 varieties of the fanciest fruit that was known in the early 1800s in the United States, and he was a lover of fine wine, and he wrote things like, "No nation is drunken when wine is cheap, and wine is indispensable to my health." And today in Virginia, there's this burgeoning Virginia wine industry. It's just really huge. We've become sort of the Napa Valley of the East. And Jefferson is often called the father of the Virginia wine industry. He had quite an impact on early American viticulture, that is, the growing of grapes. He was a great cheerleader for a lot of things, including early American grape growing and wine making. But perhaps his most significant contribution in terms of gardening was this 1,000-foot-long vegetable garden on the south side of the mountain in Monticello, terraced and some 1,000 feet long. This was really the garden of Jefferson's retirement years, between 1809, when he retired from the presidency at the age of 67, until his death at 83 in 1826. It was in many ways sort of a defiance of age for Jefferson to walk into this garden and sow peas with his own hand, or record in his garden journal when his asparagus was coming to the table, when it was being harvested. So this was a big garden for Jefferson. Even as an old man, when he was 83 years old, he read about giant 6-foot-long cucumbers in a Cleveland, Ohio newspaper. So he wrote to the governor of Ohio, Thomas Worthington, and he asked him for seeds of these giant cucumbers. And he passed them around to his friends. He sowed them with his own hands in his garden. He measured how long each one was. And Jefferson once wrote about gardening that, although an old man, I am but a young gardener. And here he was at the age of 83, very much a wide-eyed young gardener at a very advanced age. Slaves certainly took care of the farms at Monticello entirely. In the gardens, there were enslaved African-American gardeners who did much of the work, but not all of it. Jefferson's daughters and granddaughters worked in the vegetable gardens and in the flower gardens around the house. Jefferson had a series of European-trained horticulturists who worked for sporadic periods throughout Jefferson's tenure at Monticello. This is Isaac Granger Jefferson, who left an oral history of what life was like at Monticello. Years after he composed the oral history after Jefferson died, when he was freed by Jefferson's family. And it's a vivid description of what life was like living as an enslaved person at Monticello. But among his reminiscences was how about Jefferson himself would work at a right hard pace in the cool of the evening, toiling away like a gentleman in this 1,000-foot-long garden itself. Another person recalled there was a portable seed rack that was carried from planting site to planting site, and on this seed rack were hundreds of glass vials and tin canister of garden seed, of cabbages and beets and corn and so forth. And Jefferson would go and take the seed from these canisters and sow the seeds themselves in this 1,000-foot-long garden. So Jefferson is regarded as among the more cerebral figures in American history, but he was really good with his hands. He could do a lot of things. Another thing he carried with him into the garden was this ivory notebook, in which he'd make notes about his plantings in the garden, and then go back to his study and record them in his garden diary. This is a note that you can't read. This is one of Jefferson's manuscripts about designing the nature of the vegetable garden itself. And he was out surveying the garden in February of 1810 at a pretty advanced age. He was probably a little bent over with arthritis. He was probably covered with red clay soil, his boots were. And he carried with him a tool called a theodolite, which is like a transit that measures angles. And he also had a chain, which is like a yardstick, in which he would measure distances. And one can see Jefferson out in the garden moving that theodolite from one 90-degree angle to another. And then telling Wormley Hughes, who was sometimes called Monticello's head gardener and enslaved African-American, to pull the chain tight and to drive a stick at the end of that 40 feet away. So Jefferson was active in working in the garden to some extent, that's for sure. Even Isaac recalled that Jefferson was as good a hand as I knew when he would go into the blacksmith shop and make keys with metal and iron, and locks and keys in the blacksmith shop at Monticello. So Jefferson, could do things with his hands. He wasn't a pure cerebral intellectual figure, and that's something that not many people regard in terms of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson kept this diary called the Garden Book, which is a remarkable document. The Garden Book is 59 pages long, and it's bound in leather and resides today at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And in the Garden Book, one sees Jefferson as a garden scientist, recording how many Carolina beans, which would fill a quart jar, which would in turn plant so many feet of row in his garden. And this is a remarkable document here. I hope you can read part of it. but it's the organization of this 1,000-foot-long garden into three categories. And you see on the left-hand side, the vegetables were organized according to which part of the plant was being harvested, whether fruits, roots, or leaves. Leaves being lettuce and spinach, and roots being garlic and beets, and fruits being melons and peppers. And this is a real window, I think, into the mind of Thomas Jefferson. He was constantly calculating, organizing the things that were going on around him. And here he is organizing the whole vegetable realm into these three really tidy categories: fruits, roots, and leaves. Very much a Jeffersonian conceit. There's another page you can't read very well, but this is Jefferson's garden calendar. But look at the small, precise handwriting he had. It's amazing to me to read it in this original. But this is Jefferson's garden calendar from 1809, in which he has a list of 47 different vegetable varieties that he's planted in the spring of that year. And in the middle category, the middle column, if you look closely, you can see the repetition of the word failed some 17 times. Failed, failed, killed by bug. Failed nearly. Few gardeners, I think, failed as often as Thomas Jefferson, or at least wrote about failure as consistently as he did. As I said before, he wrote that the failure of one thing is repaired by the success of another. In one year, Jefferson got a letter from his granddaughter when he was serving as president, and she complained about the insects ravaging the cabbage plants as fast as she could set them out in the garden. And Jefferson responded by saying, well, the problem with the cabbage plants was not the bugs, it was the fact they were growing in such bad soil. And he said, this next winter, the two of us will cover the entire garden with a heavy coating of manure. When plants are growing in rich soil, they will, in turn, in Jefferson's words, bid defiance to all sorts of pests and diseases and weeds and all the things that befall us in a long, hot summer in central Virginia. So Jefferson believed this sort of holistic balance between wild nature on the one hand and the cultivated garden on the other. An interesting concept. But Jefferson had fun in his garden. He planted different colors of flowering beans along an arbor along the outside walk of the garden. He planted things like the caracalla bean or the snail bean, beautiful ornamental with a lovely perfume. He planted purple and white eggplants in adjacent rows and purple, white, and green sprouting broccolis. He reveled in odd-colored cabbages and multi-headed cauliflowers and other novelties of the vegetable realm. So Jefferson, in reading the garden book, one sees one man's dance with the elements in many ways in terms of his adventures with horticulture at Monticello. This is an American garden in a lot of ways. It's American in its scale and scope. It's a big, big garden, 1,000 foot long. Jefferson hired 7 slaves from a Fredericksburg, Virginia farmer, and over a period of 3 years before Jefferson was retiring from the presidency, they moved some 400,000 cubic feet of earth with a mule and a cart to create this level terrace. It was supported by a stone wall, and below the stone wall was a 400-tree orchard with 2 vineyards and berry squares of currants, gooseberries, raspberries, and figs, all surrounded by a huge 10-foot-high fence. This was Jefferson's overseer, Edmund Bacon, and as Jefferson was getting close to leaving Washington from serving as president, he'd write to Bacon and urge him on to get this terracing completed so Jefferson could begin this gardening career at Monticello in his retirement. This is the stone wall that supported that 1,000-foot-long terrace, and at the halfway point of the garden was a garden pavilion, or temple, as sometimes Jefferson would refer to it. And below it was a 400-tree orchard that formed kind of a horseshoe shape around 2 vineyards and berry patches. And then surrounded by a 10-foot-high solid board fence that ran for nearly 3/4 of a mile and had boards so close together that, according to Jefferson, not even a young hare or rabbit could get between them. This was also an American garden in the sense it was an experimental laboratory. Jefferson wrote that the greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. And he documented the planting of some 330 varieties of vegetables and some 170 different varieties of fruit. The garden really became an Ellis Island, if you will, of new and unusual crops that came literally from the 4 corners of the globe. From the Texas bird pepper that Jefferson got from an American Army captain stationed in San Antonio, Texas, to the sesame plant that Jefferson planted for its oil. When he was president, he had a blind tasting of salad oils, including olive oil, and people liked the sesame oil even better than the olive oil. So that set off this typically mad Jeffersonian obsession with growing sesame. And he grew it year in and year out. He often failed initially. He contrived and invented 3 different presses in order to extract the seed of the oil from the seed of the sesame. And he eventually was doing pretty well with this sesame cultivation. But it took a long, many, many years of failures before that happened. Or this lovely Chow de Milan cabbage, a variegated Savoy cabbage that's really quite lovely. So it's also an American garden, not just because it's big and it's an experimental thing, but also because of the way, the views that you get of the American countryside. If you look over the garden, you can see some 70 miles to the east toward Richmond, Virginia, across the rolling Virginia Piedmont. It's a view that one person referred to as the sea view, because often the distance is covered with fog and it looks like you're looking out into an ocean. If you look the other way, you can look across the garden to an adjacent mountain, to Monticello. And Monticello, of course, means little mountain. And this is Monte Alto, which is the high mountain, some 500 feet higher than Monticello itself. 2 people who finished in Monticello refer to that garden pavilion as an observatory. So one can get a sense about how this garden was consciously sited for this view of the countryside below. What one visitor, Jefferson, talked about how he cited Monticello for, he said, how sublime to look down upon the workhouse of nature. Clouds, thunder, and lightning all fabricated at our feet. And so from this garden you have a very lovely view of the workhouse of nature. One thing that made the garden truly revolutionary was the selection of crops that Jefferson grew in it. Around 1800 in Virginia, most gardeners were growing traditional European crops, particularly those that came from England. Cool season crops, cabbage family members, greens like spinach and lettuce, beet crops or root crops. What Jefferson did was he grew a lot of these new introductions that we take for granted today, but were really new plants that came from the tropical world. Things like tomatoes or green or hot and sweet peppers. Eggplants, both purple and white. Okra, from butter beans or lima beans to peanuts. From sweet potatoes to crowder peas or field peas. And the real genius of this garden is its microclimate, facing to the southeast and really catching a wealth of crop-ripening sunshine. In addition, the terracing of this garden had another effect in the sense that this made a double sort of microclimate. Because not only did it capture a wealth of sun, but because it was terraced, it often would trap that sun and make it for really a warm microclimate resembling a site hundreds of miles to the south. In the spring, one thing that is unique about a mountain with the elevation of Monticello is that in the spring and the fall, the warm air tends to rise up while the cold air settles down below. If any of you go out and walk at this time of day, you'll feel the cold places down below, but the warmer places up high. And so this often enabled Jefferson to plant vegetables in the fall to go through the winter months. Also, he would gloat over the fact that his neighbor's fruit trees were all killed by late frost while his own remained unscathed. So this is really a strange and unusual microclimate that was particularly unique. Also, it wasn't really a fussy garden. Jefferson didn't have a team of slaves working out in this garden. It was very spontaneous. It was all about trying these new things and seeing how they did and then harvesting them for the dinner table at Monticello. So it wasn't a highly maintained garden. Things was sort of a survival of the fittest garden in many ways. We know about food at Monticello from documents left by Jefferson's daughters and granddaughters. And among the really interesting recipes is one for okra soup, in effect gumbo. And the ingredients of this gumbo were really interesting. There were 2 crops that were grown by Virginia Indians when the first Europeans arrived in the 1600s. There was lima beans or butter beans in this recipe, and also patty pan squash, what Jefferson called cymblins. There were tomatoes in this recipe, and that was a Central American plant that was found by the Spanish, and then when introduced into Europe, became popular in the southern European areas, in the Mediterranean region. Also in the recipe were potatoes, native to South America. And when introduced into Europe, they didn't become popular in the Mediterranean, but they did in Northern Europe, particularly in Ireland and the Scandinavian countries. The vegetable part of this dish was brought together by okra that was brought from Africa in slave ships. And okra cuisine was sort of perfected by natives of the Caribbean, particularly the French. Then it was introduced into southern seaports and then disseminated throughout the southern parts of the United States. And this whole dish was put together in the Monticello kitchen by enslaved African-American chefs who'd been trained in the French tradition. James Hemings had been brought from Monticello and went to France to become minister to France. Fanny Hearn had been brought to the president's house in Washington when Jefferson was president to be trained by the French chef there. So what an amalgam of all these different places and traditions. Of all these vegetables that came from the different parts of the world, and people who made them that came from different parts of the world as well. And this is a diversity that went into our cuisine that began to define us as Southerners, as Virginians, and as Americans. This melting pot of vegetables and plants and materials from all over the world. Jefferson didn't live, of course, in the White House. He lived in the President's house, which was burned by the British in 1814 after Jefferson left. But when Jefferson was president, he kept a master plan of presidential meals. And it was written in French, and it was copied directly from his French chef, a man named Honoré Julien. And among the recipes, and Jefferson, there's a lot of fake lore about how Jefferson was the first person to do this or the first person to do that. But a good case can be made that he was the first person to have French fries at a presidential meal. By way of his French chef, of course. When Jefferson was president, and this is a page from the Garden Book, and this is truly a remarkable document, for the 8 years of his presidency, Jefferson, what did I do now? 8 years of his presidency, Jefferson kept this chart of 37 vegetables, and what month they first appeared, and what month they last disappeared from the farmer's market in Washington, D.C. So here was the President of the United States, and what the hell was he doing? And according to one person, Jefferson went around to foreign embassies, and they would vie with each other to give Jefferson the most unusual kind of vegetable. Jefferson would get the seeds of these vegetables and pass them out to local farmers with directions on how to grow them. And then he ordered his French maitre d', who did the shopping, to pay the highest prices for the prettiest cauliflower or the earliest tomato that came into the market. In turn, this French maitre d' recorded how much produce was bought in the year of 1806. And that one year he bought lettuce 103 different occasions. And parsley for this French cuisine on 92 different occasions. So it's an amazing document. You know, Jefferson was first in food and first in wine and in some ways first in gardening. And here he was sponsoring the local farmers markets in a very aggressive way. Jefferson's garden wasn't the only garden at Monticello. Slaves on the 5,000-acre plantation had their own vegetable gardens. And we know about them because they sold the produce to the Jefferson family. And we know what the produce was based on records that were kept by Jefferson, his wife Martha, his daughter Martha, and two of his grandchildren, and by Jefferson himself. And it was a rich array of things. This is Anne Carey Randolph, Jefferson's granddaughter. Between 1805 and 1808, between the ages of 14 and 17, her job was to buy vegetables from the slaves on Sunday afternoons, Sunday mornings actually. And at this crossroads of black and white worlds at Monticello, one wonders who was driving the hard bargain. This 14-year-old girl, sort of rites of passage, going out and doing this particular role, or these slaves whose secondary economy was based on getting a good price for 2 dozen cucumbers or 37 cabbages that were sold to the Jefferson family. This is a view of Monticello. It sure looks like a little mountain in this view. But in this field was a place where Jefferson documented in a map of his plantation one of the Abram's garden. And Abram was one of those enslaved African Americans who kept his own kitchen garden and not only used it to feed himself and his family, but also to sell and make a secondary income. This was common among southern plantations. Sometimes there would be an argument about whose crop was it, particularly if it was a cash crop like wheat or corn or tobacco. But it wasn't uncommon, it wasn't unique to Jefferson at Monticello. But again, it was provided sort of a sustenance and a self-determination among the enslaved people at Monticello. The vegetables are in some ways the stars of the show. The pea, the English pea, is often regarded as Jefferson's favorite vegetable. He grew 22 different varieties, and he planted a series of, every 2 weeks he'd plant peas, early, mid-season, and late varieties to have an extended course of peas through the season. Jefferson had a second home about 70 miles away near Lynchburg, Virginia, called Poplar Forest, and he built it after he retired to get away from all the celebrity tourists who were coming to bug him at Monticello. And when he'd come, often in the middle of May, his neighbors would always provide him with welcome home gifts, and it was often a basket of fresh peas. So it was a vegetable associated with Thomas Jefferson. He also had contests with his neighbors to see who could harvest the first English pea in the springtime. The winner hosting the losers over for a community supper that included a feast on the winning dish of peas. And Jefferson rarely won the contest. The one year he apparently did get the first pea. He refused to divulge that to the perennial winner, who was perhaps Jefferson's best friend outside the world of politics, a man named George Divers, who lived at what is now Farmington Country Club. And Jefferson designed Divers' home at Farmington. There was an octagonal room and the portico on the left side of the building. And Divers was a great, great gardener. And when Jefferson actually brought the first pea to the table, he didn't want to tell Divers because Divers was so proud of his gardening efforts. But Divers provided a lot of some of the greatest hits of Jefferson's plant collection, from tomatoes to the Spitzenberg apple. I can go on and on. But he also, he was a great source for plants at Monticello. This is Mary Randolph wrote a cookbook. She was Jefferson's second cousin. She ran a boarding house in Richmond. Her cookbook was called The Virginia Housewife, and it was one of the most influential cookbooks that were published in the 19th century. And there was a lot of connections between Mary Randolph and Jefferson's granddaughters at Monticello, and there seemed to be some exchange of recipes. Randolph had recipes for some of these really unusual vegetables that Jefferson was growing at Monticello. But her recipes for peas was pretty much every day. They were boiled and combined with mint and butter and cut up onions. One of Jefferson's granddaughters had a recipe that was much more involved. They were boiled and then sautéed with egg yolks, brown sugar, and mint, and creating a creamy sauce that sounds a little rich to me, but really good with fresh peas. The lettuce was a favorite of Jefferson. He documented planting lettuce every month of the year and harvesting lettuce every month of the year. His summer lettuce was probably a little bitter. It may have been boiled like you might do it with spinach. But here's a page or a selection from an early American horticultural magazine called The American Farmer, which began publishing in 1819 the latest new things to do in farming. And this is a garden calendar that was written by Thomas Jefferson. Calendars were directions to gardeners and what to do in each month of the year. A common way people still use that today as a way of disseminating gardening advice. And there's a general gardening calendar, and among Jefferson's words of wisdom, It's a very simple, short document, but among his pearls of wisdom was that a thimbleful of lettuce should be sowed every Monday morning from February 1st to September 1st. So think about that. The first thing you do in the work week is you get up and you sow your thimbleful of lettuce. A life lesson, like cleaning your dinner plate. You sow your lettuce every Monday morning. And he stopped doing that. But Jefferson did try to, for a while he was sowing it every 2 weeks. But interesting duty to perform every Monday from February 1st to September 1st. This is the tennis ball lettuce, one of Jefferson's favorites. He grew it often at Poplar Forest, his second home, because he said it didn't require as much attention as other sorts. And at Monticello, like at the Lew Wallace Museum, we have a collection. And it's a living collection of plants, not only ones that Jefferson grew, but others that were grown by his contemporaries. And but they often die, or we lose them. I got seed of this in 1978 from the National Seed Storage Laboratory in Fort Collins, Colorado, a repository of what's called vegetable germplasm. And I sowed we had these really pretty rows of tennis ball lettuce, and the boss at Monticello, my boss, the director, went out and harvested all the lettuce for a party he was having. So we had none that would go to seed. So I had to very shamefully write back to the National Seed Storage Laboratory and ask him for more seed. Something a good gardener never does. But a collection issue. And this is the brown Dutch lettuce, which it was a favorite for Jefferson to plant in the fall, in September. That would last throughout the winter months. A beautiful lettuce, variegated with variety of colors. Cabbage was a real garden workhorse. Jefferson documented some 27 varieties of cabbage. It was so useful because you could even just bury it in the ground after harvesting it and eat it whenever you wanted to. It keeps really well. And Jefferson had his own personal recipe for a stuffed cabbage, in which you carve out the cabbage and mix it with other vegetables and even with some ground beef. Jefferson was primarily a vegetarian, and he wrote that he ate meat only as a condiment to his meals. And so that dictated a lot of his love of vegetables. But this recipe was in his own hands. Mary Randolph, who I mentioned earlier, said that cabbage should be as beautiful cooked as it is when growing in the wild. Jefferson, in December 24th of 1822, recorded buying 79 cabbages from one of the slaves at Monticello. And again, at this intersection of black and white worlds at Monticello, one wonders what Jefferson was doing buying all these cabbages on Christmas Eve. Was he having a big party, or was he passing out cabbages as presents to the community? Interesting. And then as Jefferson was about to retire from his presidency, he wrote to his granddaughters and said, well, I can't wait to come home to my books and to my gardens and my family, and I can't wait until we can sow our cabbages together. So this rather modest vegetable is used as an image of the familial happiness. Jefferson used plants to relate to friends, family, neighbors, even political allies. He'd often begin letters in the future of the American Republic with a discussion of how his seeds and gardens and plants were doing at Monticello. So there was this union of gardening and friendship and gardening and family. This is a kind of cabbage called sea kale, and it's called sea kale because it grows wild on the beaches of Great Britain. And it's a perennial. It comes up every year, and as it came up on the beaches, it would often be covered by wind-driven beach sand. And that blanched it. It kept the photosynthesis from occurring and kept the leaves really white and much more tender and delectable to eat. So gardeners used pots, high pots, 20 inches high, and covered their sea kale to protect them from the sun when they were about to harvest it. Then, like with asparagus, after cutting it in the springtime, you let it grow and produce food for the next year. Jefferson ordered 200 sea kale pots from a Richmond, Virginia potter. And Jefferson failed miserably in his initial plantings of seed of the sea kale. But then, this is the sea kale if you let it grow. It's a beautiful plant with that bluish-green foliage, very ornamental. In 1818, after failing, Jefferson got 200 plants from this man, another neighbor named John Hartwell Cock. And Cock was successful in a lot of things that Jefferson failed at. He had a beautiful house along the James River called Bremo, a great expression of traditional Italian architecture. And as a slave owner, as a farmer, and as a financial manager, John Hartwell Cock was much more successful than Jefferson, and he came to the rescue to Jefferson's garden for that case. Jefferson grew tomatoes as a culinary vegetable for some 20 years. When the vegetable was first introduced, really into southern Europe, and right after Columbus arrived in the New World, it was met with a certain amount of scorn. Herbalists who would describe it were kind of frightened by it. The large red juicy fruits and the stinky climbing, vining character of the leaves. And so it got associated with other members of the nightshade family. But in the Mediterranean region, it was still popular, but in Northern Europe, it was scorned by a lot of gardeners. It was late to be introduced into North America. Here's a painting by the son of a very important Philadelphia portrait painter, Charles Wilson Peale, who Mr. Peale, his father, grew these tomatoes in his garden in Philadelphia, and in 1797, one of the sons did this illustration. You can see what an early tomato looked like, with a heavy lobed effect. They weren't smooth like they are today. Some people call them ugly tomatoes. This is purple calabash, one of my favorites, that was reputed to be a native plant from Central America, very, very old. And another one behind behind it is Castelluto Genovese, an Italian heirloom. What else about the tomato? Jefferson had a son-in-law named Thomas Mann Randolph, who became governor of Virginia, and he was an excellent farmer. And he gave a speech before local progressive farmers in Albemarle County, where Monticello was, in 1822. And his speech was about plant introduction, how new plants were helping people and improving the economy. And he said, remember, 15 years ago, no one in Albemarle County grew tomatoes, but now everyone's growing them because they believe they quickens the blood in the summertime. So there's a little bit of the medicinal quality that was thought that the potatoes provided that led to their overwhelming acceptance as the queen of the garden today. The queen of the garden in the early 1800s is probably the turnip, the lowly turnip, because it could be stored so effectively and eaten throughout the year. There's a lovely recipe in the Jefferson family manuscripts for turnips with cheese. The turnips are boiled and then pushed through cheesecloth and then mixed with cheese. It's kind of like macaroni and cheese, kind of Jeffersonian comfort food. And so turnips were a big deal among a lot of gardeners. This is the flower garden of Landon Carter, who lived at a place called Sabin Hall in the northern neck of Virginia. And Carter was the richest man in Virginia at the time of the American Revolution. And he had a really fancy flower garden, and this is a reproduction of its shape without the flowers in it. And in August of one year, he was bemoaning the fact that his garden was been devastated by drought, and his flowers weren't doing well, and he also had gout, so he wasn't feeling good. So he said, I know I'm going to plow up my flower garden. I'm going to plant turnips. So he plowed up his turnips and he plowed up his flowers and planted turnips and wrote, well, at least I can eat the turnips. Sort of his way of getting back at the world was killing his flowers and planted turnips. Another, John Hartwell Cock, who I mentioned earlier, also, he plowed up his front yard and planted turnips around his house. People are interested in that kind of gardening today. What do you call it when you plant practical plants, practical vegetables? Edible landscaping. And I'm not sure people would choose turnips today. And this is salsify, or salsify. And it was a favorite in the Jefferson kitchen. Jefferson's granddaughters had various recipes for its preparation. Mary Randolph talked about boiling them and then mashing them up with breadcrumbs into patties and frying them like sausages. And they're called oyster plant or They have also a flavor like artichoke heart. They're really quite good for a root vegetable. And cucumbers were a favorite of Jefferson's. There was a family story that was related by Jefferson's great-great-grandson around the time after the Civil War. And he said that there was a family story that on July 1st of 1826, Jefferson went out into his garden and ate a raw cucumber. And then he felt bad after that and died 3 days later. So the sort of jocular Jefferson family story was that Jefferson was killed by a cucumber. Jefferson wasn't the only one to be infatuated with huge cucumbers. This is really in the cucumbers. It's called a cucumber, but it really isn't. It's more like a squash. But there was a great gardener in Williamsburg 40 years before Jefferson was born named John Custis, and he received seeds from Europe of a cucumber that was supposed to have particularly large fruits, and he gave them to his son-in-law, who planted them in New Kent County. And there was a story in the Williamsburg newspaper, a weekly called the Virginia Gazette, about how people were riding from Williamsburg on their horses 10, 15 miles to see these great curiosities, these 5 and 6 foot long cucumbers. And this guy in Massachusetts was a reader of the Virginia Gazette, and he wrote a letter to the editor and said, yeah, I want to see your 6 foot cucumbers, but wait till you see our 800-pound watermelons we can grow up here in Boston. So it set this sort of mock civil war about who had the biggest vegetables. This garden was recreated in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This is a view of Monticello in 1975. We had parking lots all the way up to the front of the house. And one of the advantages of recreating that vegetable garden, the terrace was there, but part of it was covered with asphalt parking lots. But we were also able to eliminate the parking lots, and so it didn't have buses running 40 feet from the front portico, their air conditioners in the middle of the summertime. And we did archaeology to determine some of the character of this garden. Every time you disturb our heavy red clay soil, you leave some sort of lasting imprint in terms of the color or the texture of the soil itself, so that archaeologists, many years later, by carefully troweling off the soil, can see stains in the ground where the root system and the trunk rotted away. And in this aerial view, you can see little white dots everywhere. In the left center of the screen are the dots regularly spaced where they found the stains of Jefferson's fruit trees that formed a pattern very much like a plan that Jefferson had done of this orchard in 1778. And then along the far left of your screen, you can see closer dots, very regular, every 10 feet apart. And that's where the black locust fence posts from this paling fence had dissolved into the ground. So the garden was recreated very carefully based on the archaeology. Here's the fence, and actually that's the actual entrance to the garden. We just have a sample of it up today. And here's some archaeology of the garden wall, which had disappeared. But we found some good samples of it that enabled us to reconstruct it in 1980. As well as this is the footings for the garden pavilion that was recreated and rebuilt, restored in 1984. And the story goes it was a favorite place for Jefferson to read in the cool evening. And the story also was it was blown down in a violent storm in a year after Jefferson died. And it is indeed perched kind of precariously atop that stone wall. This is 1982, 81, 82, after we redid the beds in the garden according to Jefferson's notes. Here I was as a young pup, and I was there for 35 years, and so I should know something. The garden has inspired a lot of artistic efforts over the years. This is a really pretty aerial view of the rows in the garden and the grass paths. And a woman named Laura Nicholson did what do you call it? She did a cloth version of this. What's that called? A tapestry, that's it. And it's much bigger than what it looks like in the slides, but it's an enormous thing that hung in the Chicago Institute of Art for a number of years. A beautiful work of art. And this is her one of her tapestries of root crops that were harvested in the 1990s from that garden. And here's a whimsical view of the garden with the hollyhocks growing spontaneously, Monticello in the distance. Annie Leibovitz, perhaps the most famous photographer in the world, came a few years ago, and she was doing a book on pilgrimages to famous places. And she came to Monticello, but all she wanted to do was take pictures of vegetables, piles of vegetables. So I'd go into the garden, I'd dig up some sweet potatoes and make a pile of sweet potatoes, and she'd take a picture, and then I'd make a pile of beets. She'd go and take these really stark pictures of the beet piles. And I was complaining to her because I was working a book on the vegetable garden, and I could never get a photographer to be there at the right time when everything looked pretty and the garden, the light was just right. She said, "Oh, you should be taking your own pictures. Here, you can have my camera." So she gave me her camera, and it's like having Babe Ruth's bat, or it should be. But it didn't help me a whole lot. My daughter had to really help me a lot with learning how to use it. This is one of the pictures she took. They wouldn't let me use her pictures in my book. But this is actually around the end of November. There's still leaves on the trees and beautiful light. And Alice Waters is the famous chef who started a restaurant in Berkeley, California in the 60s and has been sort of the mother of the farm-to-table movement, eating fresh food, organically grown. She's been particularly important in working on the schoolyard gardens throughout the United States. And she came to Monticello about 10 years ago to prepare a dinner, black-tie dinner for 300 donors on a tent in the West Lawn. And here she is washing lettuce with our gardeners. And Eleanor in the purple is looking kind of askance at Alice Waters' washing technique. But she proclaimed it the finest, or the most important dinner she'd ever made. But I guess that's what a lot of people say about everything they do. It's the best one I ever tasted. And Michelle Obama, when she came to Washington, she brought with her her family chef, Sam Cass, the guy second from the left, who was put in charge of the White House Food Initiative to not only try to improve the nutrition of school children across the country, but also to develop the White House kitchen garden. And he didn't know much about gardening, but he called me up, and I invited him to Monticello and gave him a tour of the gardens and tried to inspire him with the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. So he returned and he reserved a site in the garden, the Thomas Jefferson section of the garden, growing his favorite vegetables and also having this sign, "The failure of one thing repaired by the success of another." But I went for a few times for ceremonial plantings in the spring times, and the garden soil was just beautiful. It was thriving with earthworms. It was rich and had great tilth. And going to plant at this really was a difficult time in this country at that time as well. The Congress and the President were really divided. There were political tensions all over. But to go there at this time, at this difficult period, and plant a garden with school children was really reinforced my belief in the human character a great deal. Culmination, a lot of my work at Monticello was this book on the vegetable garden, A Rich Spot of Earth. And it's a pretty book, but it's also a work of scholarship. Yale University Press published it. It has a foreword by Alice Waters. And I had 4 different books on the gardens at Monticello. I had an interesting job. I was in charge of 2,000 acres, and oversaw 17 people taking care of the gardens. And I started institutes for 2-week institutes for the study of historic landscape preservation, and was a project manager for a big project developing a park leading into Monticello. But it was easy to write books about Thomas Jefferson compared to keeping the deer out of the cabbage plants. It really was. So I think that's the end of my talk. But thank you very much. I have the book for sale. It's $30. You can only give me a cash or a check, but I'll give you the book if you'll promise to send me a check or a cash later on. But thanks a lot. I enjoyed talking to you. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
We today produce so much in this country for the rest of the world. And I look at this and I look at no pesticides. Well, if there were pesticides, they're very basic things you could probably find in your kitchen to ward off pests.
Whatever thing was available.
You're right. And even with your last comment about keeping the deer out, they were useful too.
Uh-huh.
They would provide protein.
They weren't eating everybody's suburban garden back then, I'll tell you that.
It's just amazing how we depend now on pesticides.
Right, that's a great question. In many ways, the gardens in Jefferson's day enjoyed a sort of an age of innocence. A lot of our worst pests come from other parts of the world. They're exotic imports. A lot of our native plants, a lot of our native diseases really weren't that serious at the time. So Jefferson enjoyed a certain age of innocence, but by the early 1800s in orchards, you started to hear stories about peach tree borers and the yellows, the serious virus, and you start hearing more and more problems with disease and pestilence. And as civilization advanced and conditions became more artificial, it presented a much an easier dinner for pests to develop and cater to our crops. So it's interesting, Jefferson doesn't mention ever combating a pest with any technique. But at the time, this American farmer, they used whatever products were available. Some people, smoked their vineyards with nicotine, with tobacco. John Hartwell Cock wrote an article in the American Farmer in which he wrapped his peach trees with tobacco leaves to prevent peach tree borers from getting into the trunks. It sounds like a perfect solution to me. So a lot of ashes and lime and various things were used to propel pestilence. But it's interesting. I talk about that some in my book, both that book and also my fruit tree book, about what people use to try to counteract issues. Yes?
How Jefferson tracked the harvest dates and first and last harvest dates of all the different vegetables, all the charts. Have you compared those? How similar it is to today? Have the dates shifted?
Yeah, they have shifted a little bit. I haven't compared them very well, but he kept the daily minimum maximum temperatures, and we did that. I did that for 35 years, but there was a serious flaw. And he also said things like it rarely went above 90 degrees, but he was also a pamphleteer for the climate in North America. He wanted to make it look good. And his measurements for reading temperatures might have been flawed, and where he took the temperature may have been a little flawed. But my whole 35 years, we took daily minimum and maximum temperatures. And but the problem was, I talked about that air drainage. In our place, we took the temperatures was about 150 yards down the mountain. And so Jefferson took his measurements on the east portico. So when we started comparing my measurements 200, 150 feet down and the measurements at the top of the hill, we found that there was a big difference. It was a lot warmer on top of the hill. I thought that was really interesting, but it screwed up 35 years of taking temperatures to really get a clear idea. But it does seem like, now we can have 70 or 80 days, 90 degrees and above. And I know Jefferson, I believe him in some ways. He rarely found 90-degree days. So that's interesting. He was very interested in meteorology. And one of the reasons for that was because he believed the climate was changing. That it was getting hotter. And so he wanted to try and document that, which is very kind of a timely issue that still we're learning about today. Yes?
So you mentioned that it's clay soil, so that's usually pretty hard to garden in. So how often did you, in the gardens, amend it with manure or other things?
Yeah, it was a big thing. I really loved adding compost or rotted leaves or rotted wood chips or manures to the soil. And we try to cover the garden every year with a heavy load of compost or a load of some sort of organic matter. But the heavy red clay soil is a rich soil. And actually settlers settled along the belt where this Catoctin greenstone soil, as it was called, was native to. But, we turned our soil. It was getting pretty, there was a picture of when I first came, the archaeology, and it was just pure red dirt. By the time I left, it was pretty rich and dark looking, which I was proud of. But then 10 years later, I go back and it's red again. My predecessors have not kept that up. But on the other hand, it looks more like it did in Jefferson's day, probably. He gave instructions to his head gardener, Wormley Hughes, to go to a nearby place where there was horse manure. It was 3 miles away down the mountain, and bring in 70 wagon loads of manure, and drop a wagon load every 5 yards along the garden. But first he had to fix the road. So I don't know if that was ever done or not. But when I came, it was really red looking. It was astonishing, and it is pretty much very red looking now. It's more authentic, but I may have been giving them a big gift. They may be living off my legacy. I'm not sure. The earth belongs to the living, according to Jefferson. Yes. Let me answer another question. Yes.
I was wondering what the tall things are in the...
Those are teepees for beans.
Okay.
Those are probably lima beans or green beans. My future wife worked at a museum in Lexington, Virginia, and her boss was a very stickler for historical accuracy. She said she went to Monticello, and the gardener at this place, it was a Robert E. Lee museum, was using these teepees to train his beans on. And she wanted to know why he did that. He said, well, it's because I saw it at Monticello. So she had my future wife call me and ask me, where was the historical documentation for those sorts of teepees? And I said, I have no idea. It just seems like a natural way to stake beans. So then she became eventually my wife. But they took down those teepee beans at the Robert E. Lee Museum house in Lexington, Virginia, because of me. You want one more question? And then we'll get out of here.
I was just thinking about how were the terraces leveled, or were they tiled for drainage, or?
No.
I would imagine they would catch more moisture this way as well.
Yeah, I think that they drain pretty well. I wonder what the slope is. I never thought about that because we never had real bad issues with it. When I first came, it seemed really wet to work in the springtime, and you can't work that heavy clay when it's wet. That's a big mistake. It turns into bricks real fast.
I have a viewpoint because I'm an agronomist. I look at this in a whole different. I used to work for Bayer or Mobank Chemical Corporation. And I see these things in a different light.
Well, it's always drained well, but I've never thought a lot about that. Whether there is in the elevation difference between the this side and the other side. Another issue is, he went down here on this side of the garden, 15 feet, or seven enslaved workers did, and then that was moved and it was piled high over there. So the quality, when I wondered about the quality of the soil, where they went down 12 feet, but it's fine. So there must have been some efforts made to bring the good soil back to where they'd gone so deep. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you. Thank you very much.